Good evening. I'm Graham Fanco, Chairman of the Scottish branch of the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society. Welcome to this evening's live stream. The weather is beginning to warm up nicely and Waverley will be sailing in just over a week's time. This year she'll be sailing from all four parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. For information on the Waverley sailings, check out the Waverley Excursions website. Tonight's speaker, John Megoran. He is at the other end of the country, but due to the technical wizardry of Alan Smith, my Vice Chairman, we are able to present this live stream. John has had a lifelong interest in paddle steamers. If you read his Megoran's musings on the PSPS website, he tells us that as a schoolboy, he was a crew member on the Jeannie Deans on part of a trip from the Clyde to the Thames to become the Queen of the South. Tonight, John will be giving us the latest information on Waverley's little sister, the Kingswear Castle. John first commanded Kingswear Castle as one of her volunteer captains back in 1984, before she had a full passenger certificate, and then he became her regular captain and general manager from 1985 to 2012, when she was in full service on the River Medway. During these years, he has become very familiar with the repair work required to keep a 60-plus-year-old paddle steamer operating, and with the challenges of finding the necessary business to balance the books. In 2012, an agreement with the Dark Company saw Kingswear Castle return to the river for which she was built. And since then, in his capacity as chairman of the trust which owns the ship, John has built up a strong relationship with her new operators and has made every effort to safeguard her future through to her centenary in 2024 and well beyond. As part of this, the Kingswear Castle is currently undergoing a substantial rebuild, and we are pleased that this evening John will be updating us on the progress with this work. At the end of the presentation, John has kindly agreed to answer some questions. To ask a question, use the YouTube chat facility at any time during the presentation, and hopefully John can answer it at the end. That's all from me. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Graham. I will just get my screen up and shared. And there we are. So we're talking tonight, as you know, about Casey's rebuild. And here she is in Old Mill Creek at Dartmouth with a whole lot of stuff taken out of on her deck. Just to put it into perspective, I remember talking with Alan Robinson, who founded the PSPS in 1959, some little while ago, and he told me that he believed, as many people did back then, that basically paddle steamers laid up in the winter. They were painted up in the spring and they operated in the summer, and then they were laid up in the winter once again. And that was a very commonly held view, I think. But as Alan came to discover later, it just is not so. Sadly, steel rusts, wood rosts, and the ships deteriorate. It is an understandable belief, given that Alan sailed a lot on Cousins paddle steamers from Bournemouth in particular. And at that time, the Consul was 63 years old in 1959, having been built in 1896. The Embassy was 48 years old, having been built in 1911. And the Monarch was 36 years old, having been built in 1924. So they're all well over 30 years old. But they'd all had major structural work or rebuilds to keep them going. For example, the Consul, which was built in 1896, she was rebuilt after the First World War. More work was done on her when she was bought by Cousins in 1937. She had another complete rebuild after the Second World War. Embassy of 1911 work was done when she was bought by Cousins in 1938. And she had a major rebuild after the Second World War. And in my childhood, I remember lots of work being done on her in the 1960s, including quite substantial redecking. The wheelhouse also, the deck in the wheelhouse leaked into the captain's cabin, I remember, so that was lifted up and had to be recorked. And Monarch, which was the most recent, she had a lot of steel work was necessary when she was bought in 1951 by Cousins, and she had a new inner funnel in 1959. So ships need work. And ships are built for a design life of, as we all know, 25 to 30 years. And the average age when ships are scrapped is, as you can see, going up. In 2016, the average age was 23 years, and by 2022, it was 29 years. And the picture there is a scrapyard in Turkey with a number of liners, including the one in the foreground there, the Carnival Imagination, built in 1995, withdrawn for scrap in 2020. So once again, 25 years old. So there is this magic figure, really, of 25 to 30 years is the design life of a ship. Of course, you can extend that by careful maintenance, really looking after it, not sending it out too much in the hurly-burly and such like. But basically, ships are designed for a life of up to 30 years, after which it is expected, generally speaking, that they'll be scrapped. And of course, if you do nothing to a ship, they deteriorate readily. And we have a good example with the Ride, built in 1937. She had a major rebuild after the Second World War, having run as a minesweeper during the war. She was withdrawn in 1969, 32 years old, slightly over 30 years, but she had had that rebuild. But once she went to Binfield on the Isle of Wight, where she became a restaurant, bar, nightclub, etc., nothing really was done to her. And by the 1990s, really she was falling apart, as you can see in the picture on the right, with the funnel falling down. And that's a picture of the Ride to date. So that is really what happens to a ship. If you do nothing to it for more than 50 years, you must expect that to happen to it. Here's another example, the USS The Sullivans. She has been open in Buffalo Naval Park in America for some years. She was built in 1943, but she sunk in April of last year. They knew that there were issues with her hull, and in fact, she had constant bilge pumps going on. But one night, the holes got bigger, and eventually they found that she had 53 separate holes, and she sunk. And that is also a good reminder of the importance of checking the draft marks on ships. I remember I used to always say to the crew on KC, check the draft marks when you come aboard. And I remember one guy saying to me, "Oh, well, are you expecting the ship to sink then?" Well, no, I'm not expecting the ship to sink, but if it has got issues, I want to know about it sooner rather than later. All who run paddle steamers know this, and they know that ships have finite lives. Here we've got the Cornish Albert on the left there, built in 1885, and in her current reconstructed form as the Meissen. I mean, almost different ships. And as you can see in the picture there, that's a good example of work done. You can see on the left of the picture the rivets. So there is some original or earlier work still left in the hull. And not all steel corrodes away straight away. Some can last quite extended periods. But move to the right, you see the welds there where new hull plating has gone in. And in all the successful European paddle steamer operations, I think there has been a combination of traditional with modern techniques, and that's pretty typical. As we know, all the Swiss paddle steamers have been rebuilt several times. The Stadtlutzern has been rebuilt twice in the last 35 years. When I first went there in the late 1980s, she had just emerged from a rebuild, and she was taken out of service for another complete rebuild, 2019 to 2021. And the same elsewhere in Switzerland. Recent examples on Lake Geneva, the Vevey was rebuilt 2012-13, the Italy 2015-2016, the Rhone 2019 to 2021. And for this, they're taken back to nothing. The steel work on the hull is renewed as necessary. They don't renew steel if it doesn't need renewing, but they renew the steel that does need renewing, and completely redecked. And that really is the template for the work that we've done on KC. And there is the shipyard, the covered shipyard at Lausanne Ushi, with Italy there, 2015 to 2016. And that gives a flavour of the quantity of work that's going on. So when you go on the Italy today, you are going on a paddle steamer built shortly after the turn of the century, but a lot of it is different. The decks are not the same, a lot of the steelwork, etc., is different. And of course, we all know we're their own Waverley. Built in 1947, she was sold at the end of her design life in 1974 when she was 27 years old. The following 25 years, there was an enormous amount of steel work done to her in the winters and decks, etc. She had a new boiler in 1981. And then, as we all remember, a complete rebuild at Great Yarmouth in 2001. So if you want to keep ships sailing, you have to keep rebuilding them, and you have to somehow find the money to keep doing that. So to KC. Well, she was built in 1924, as we know, and she was 36 years old, so she was already beyond her design life. Although during the war, the Second World War, she hadn't run that much. She did run a bit during the war, but not much, but she was beyond the design life. And to demonstrate this 30-year rule once again, they found that the Board of Trade in 1960 was saying, well, you're going to have to do major work on this ship if you're going to keep it in service. She needed hull doubling, she needed a new boiler, and so there were discussions as to whether it was worth doing the work or not. At that time, the River Dart Steamboat Company had been taken over by Evans and Reed of Cardiff, and we have in our archive some correspondence between the two with the Dart Company saying, well, is it worth doing this work on this ship given how old she is? And against the odds, Evans and Reed saying, yes, go ahead, we need it. Because in 1960, the business was still really quite buoyant on the Darts, with the 3 paddle steamers with passenger certificates for more than 400. They could put 1,200 people afloat at any one time, and they needed that capacity. So she had that work done. And in fact, the new boiler that they put in there was very handy when we came to start running KC on the Medway, because the boiler had not had that much use. Well, she was bought by Paddle Steam Navigation Limited on behalf of the PSPS in 1967, and she moved to the Isle of Wight. And this is a nice picture of her in along with the Ride and the Medway Queen at Binfield in 1971. These were pictures taken by Derek Gorn and his father. She steamed a couple of times on the Isle of Wight, and this is a picture of her of Cowes. And there she is on the Medina, blowing off steam. It's almost a sackable offence on the ship to let the safety valves lift. The railway trains, the safety valve lift all the time, but on ships you really don't want the safety valves to lift if you can possibly avoid it, because you're wasting water and you may not have facilities for replacing that water. And with a ship you can avoid the safety valves lifting by if the pressure is too high, putting on some pumps or something like that. I mean, that is an issue actually with a paddle steamer and a coal-fired paddle steamer with the boiler, that you need to control the boiler so that the safety valves don't lift. And therefore you need to be, or the person firing the boiler needs to be aware of when to put the coal in when you want steam, and to damp the boiler down when you're coming into piers and such like when you don't want steam. Another disadvantage of the safety valves lifting is that they're very noisy, and the safety valves on KC's new 2001 boiler are immensely noisy. And there she is at Cowes, shortly before she was moved to the Medway. Well, during the 1970s, she was sort of rebuilt. I don't think it's fair to say really that she was restored in that period. I think it's fairer to say that she got into a state where she could regain her passenger certificates to run again, because there was absolutely no money. In the 1970s, from 1974, not surprisingly, there was a huge focus on the Waverley, and there were machinations in the background of the PSPS and a big fallout, I remember, with Mrs. Pritchard, who was very much in favour of KC. And of course, money didn't come really to her. And the work was really done very much on the cheap. They just didn't have the money for buying quality stuff. The decking was not good quality wood, really. And to save money, instead of using proper pucker marine glue, they used road tar for caulking. But all credit to them for getting KC going again. If they hadn't done that, she would certainly not be here today in her current form. And it was really in the late 1970s when Babcock became involved and started providing some real expertise to underpin the project that the project really took off. But I don't think you could do it like that today, because today the MCA are interested in every facet of what's going on. You have to provide certificates for this and certificates for that, and make sure the steel is just so and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think you could do that today. But they did, and all credit to them. Huge respect for what was done in that period. And she ran trials, as Graham mentioned, in 1984. There she is, alongside Knight's Pontoon off Rochester. But it wasn't long before we discovered that really she still needed a lot of work. The hull condition, not really a lot had been done to the hull during the 1970s. And I remember one terrible day when I was chipping away with my hammer underneath, and my hammer went up inside the hull and knocked a hole in it. And if you looked, I remember the MCA or whatever it was called then, the Department of Transport surveyor, Mr. Ahmed, saying to me, "John, there's a bit of hull here. These rivets, they don't seem to have any heads on them." And he was right, they didn't. So in 1991, we got the funding to renew the whole of the bottom, and so the whole of the bottom was renewed from the bow to the stern and from the keel to about a foot above the waterline. The 1961 boiler lasted very well, but by 1999-2000, the insurance surveyors were making issues with it, and so we put a new boiler in from Welburn Roby, pretty much identical, a carbon copy really of the earlier boiler. And we were pretty insistent that it would have the domed ends. Most modern boilers have got flat ends, like a Smartie packet with a thing stuck in each end. The traditional boilers had a domed end, which is better for expansion. Decks. One looks at decks and thinks, oh, well, these go on forever, but they don't. We renewed decks in the Medway years more than once. And there is Chris Smith. Some of you will remember Chris. He was my right-hand man at Chatham, a really great guy and huge contributor to KC, who very sadly died at the age of 62 back in September. We had a legacy in 2001, and we used that to renew the sponsons there in the Acorn shipyard shipyard at Shroom. And 2008, some of the steel work around the bow above the level of the steel that we'd replaced was so bad that we actually put a completely new bow on in 2008. And the paddle boxes, which had been renewed in the 1970s, they were falling apart by 2005. So there's Chris Smith again in his blue hat, renewing the steel work and then the woodwork around the paddle wheels. One guy from the 1970s who was important in two respects, Laurie Beale. There were plans to get rid of KC in the 1970s because things were not working out too well, but Laurie stepped in, and with him there, that didn't happen. And Laurie's other main contribution was that he provided the paddle wheels. He worked for Stone Manganese, I think it was called, and they built these two paddle wheels free and gratis for KC. So that's a major contribution from Laurie, which lives on today. And in 2010, we had commissioned a brand new coach roof. So there's a lot done in the Medway years to improve the ship. which of course then raises the question, why rebuild her in 2020? And we look at all the work that has been done previously, but in 1985, when we put it back into service up to 2020, that's 35 years. That's again beyond the design life of ships. And remember KC, as we saw a moment ago, 1924 to 1960, that was 36 years, and they needed steel work on the hull and a new boiler. And by 2020, the new hull plates we put on, they were 30 years old, so that's the ship's design life. And the frames and the bulkheads, the stringers and the keelson had never really been addressed. And our new decks were now starting to go rotten. Now, of course, amongst that, some of the work that we did was fine and hasn't needed addressing, as with the Swiss rebuilds. You know, you don't replace everything just for the sake of replacing it. You replace what needs replacing. But after 30 years, a lot does need replacing. But then there's the vexed question of how do you do it, which people exercise themselves over sometimes. Particularly, should it be done absolutely in a traditional fashion with rivets, or should modern techniques be used with welding? Well, the problem with rivets is it's difficult sourcing the necessary skills. Ship riveting hardly exists today. Well, it doesn't exist. The Medway Queen was rebuilt with riveting, as you will remember, and on the insistence of the Heritage Lottery Fund, but hasn't steamed at all since then. And you can do work with modern methods to keep the costs down. And as I say, as we all know, since the 1980s, all the Swiss paddle steamers have been rebuilt using that combination of modern techniques, but making the ships look traditional. And this really is sort of what we were up against. Here we are in a part of the ship, one of the stringers here, if you look at that, get your magnifying glass out, you can see that's almost corroded through. It's got a hole right down through the middle of it. And a lot of the issues with ships, they're out of sight. You don't see them. You're in the nice places, look at the nice things, but you start ripping down paneling and such like, you look behind that and you find things like that. Here we've got the hull on the starboard side leading out to the sponson. And what we renewed was at the outboard side of that. So that bit of steel there, well, you can see what terrible condition that was in. And there is some of the discarded steel work, which is, was cut out from the ship. And some of the new steel waiting to go in, which, as I say, now all has to come with appropriate certificates, etc. One also needs to remember, in terms of the longevity of these paddle steamers, that they were often very lightly constructed. And they were lightly constructed to keep the draft down so they could go to piers in shallow water. And when on the Dart, topness pretty much dries out. Low tide, you can only get in there 2 or 3 hours either side of the low water. And so the steel plate is not thick. I mean, KC's steel plate is 6 millimeters and 8 millimeters. It was initially built in the strakes of 6 millimeter strake and an 8 millimeter strake, etc. And if you get your ruler out and look at 6 millimeters, that's not terribly thick. So you haven't got to start getting much pitting before you're almost going through. Well, the work commenced at the yard. There's sort of the wood being pulled out. And on the right, we're looking at the aft saloon. Initially, because we wanted to get started on the work and the slipway wasn't available, we did some of this work alongside, and that really required the hull to be strengthened, so strengthening beams put in, so that it didn't lose its shape. There in the aft saloon, looking up, and there are the new beams across the top of the aft saloon. And there we're on deck, looking down into the aft saloon and into the aft well deck. As built, Kingswear Castle, the deck all had steel tongues in it, and that gave an added strength to the ship. We replaced that idea in this rebuild with putting in a steel deck a thinner steel deck with traditional wood on top, so you won't notice any difference. But putting that steel deck in adds a lot of strength to the ship. I mean, one of the problems, particularly with KC, is that she hasn't got a lot of longitudinal strength. She's quite a long ship, 112 feet with no binding superstructure. Therefore, if you're in any sort of lop, and she wasn't built to be out in any sort of lop, but on the Megoran and the Thames, she sometimes was out in some sort of lop, the bow and the stern being lifted up at different rates, which causes flexing. I mean, not massive flexing, but flexing. But anyway, this hopefully will strengthen the ship, has strengthened the ship considerably. When we did the bottom, extended only about a foot above the waterline, and the bit above that, from the new steel up to the deck, was original. And we found, as the years went on, that some of that was getting very iffy, particularly up underneath the deck, and those surveyors know just where to look for these things. Surveyors would go around with a hammer, bang, and the hammer would go through. So we have renewed from the engine room to the stern that straight beneath the deck, and you can see that there on the right side, the new steel being put in. And there it is, painted with that anti-corrosive grey paint. A lot of the hull from 1990, we had to put some inserts in some places, but on the whole, that has lasted not too badly. And here we are back up on deck again, looking at the structure, putting in steel in readiness for putting the wood on top. And here we are now down in the bilge. She was very lightly constructed. The frames had never been addressed. When we did the steel hull in 1991, we did frames a little bit as and where absolutely necessary, but they weren't all redone. But now they have been. Now you can see the extensive work that's been going on to strengthen the ship up. There we are in the aft saloon, looking forward, and you can see the frames there have all been redone, and there are new stringers and a new keelson and new bulkheads. All of the bulkheads have been renewed throughout the ship, and the bulkheads were getting a bit iffy, really. They were all ever so slightly bent due to the sort of flexing of the hull over the years, and certain parts of them had to be patched up. I mean, this bulkhead, its predecessor bulkhead, had a number of patches in which we had to put in over the years when surveyors' hammers had gone through. But there we got new bulkheads throughout, and the bulkheads have been strengthened by having the vertical supports welded to them. There we are again in the aft saloon. Now we're looking aft to the aft saloon door. You can see the new stringers there, and all the nice work on the frames. And on the right-hand side with the porthole cut at that moment, the new steel that has been put in for that. So there's been an enormous amount of work going on so far. Here we are on the forward saloon, a similar sort of situation. And that's the forward bulkhead. And one thing we are doing in this rebuild is we put a bow thrust on some years ago, which we never use very much, but it is a handy thing to have. We have moved the bow thrust engine from the engine room into this compartment underneath the foredeck. And that has the advantage of removing the fire risk from a hydraulic thing having a hydraulic engine in the engine room. And hopefully it'll quieten it down being kept in this compartment. Forward saloon again. There we are at the aft end of the forward saloon, looking forward. This is Richard James, who's the yard manager, with some of the Douglas fir for the deck. Richard James has been an absolute star in all this, along with Paul Merrington, the engineering director for the company. Their attention to detail is excellent, really. I mean, it cannot be faulted. And I think we are really lucky to have had this company working on our ship, because they don't charge us for their own in-house labour. They don't charge us because we're working with them as partners for the use of the facilities, etc., which has really kept the costs down. And there, the wood, the deck planking, is thinner than it was before because it's now going down on steel decking. Those are two bunker hatches with Richard James has built for the ship. I mean, they're sort of a yacht-like finish, really, I think. They have their own varnishing shed at Dartmouth, and that is such a boon. In the Midway years, doing the varnishing was always difficult. It was always, you were outside and it was cold and wet and such like. And really, for good varnishing, you need an ambient, warmish temperature, and they have their own shed for this there. The portholes all came out and were addressed, and have now all gone back in again. And I remember somebody pointing out, looking at a picture of the portholes having just gone in. Oh, look, they've all been polished, which they had. Other work's gone on. The boiler feed pump on the right has been away from major service, and on the left you can see the telegraph, the engine room telegraph there, which is in the workshop for work. You need pumps, obviously, to pump the water back into the boiler. KC has a variety of pumps for this. That pump is used for pumping feed water from our feed tank. There is an engine-driven feed pump, which pumps the water back into the boiler as fast as the steam is being used. And there is a general service pump, which can be used for that as well. But here things are coming on now. We're looking aft, and you can see the new deck, which has been laid on top of the steel there on the left and on the right. And looking down into the well deck. We now got some anti-corrosive paint, which is going on. I look at this anti-corrosive grey paint, and it immediately makes me think of Switzerland, because that's exactly the same sort of grey anti-corrosive paint they put on the inside of their paddle steamers when they rebuild and refurbish them. And we're looking into the aft well deck again. You can see the new deck. That's new deck which has been laid on top of the steel work. I think it's also interesting to look at how little there is of KC beneath the water, really. Now, one issue with KC is the freeboard. The MCA have a minimum freeboard, not surprisingly, and KC's least freeboard is in the aft well deck. We have had a naval architect working on the project with us and advising on it. But we have, in a sense, been adding weight. We're putting in beefed up frames and so on. But there's a balance with, for example, the decks. You'll put in steel decks, but the wood is not so thick, etc. But as a belt and braces, we have raised the freeboard in the aft well deck. And if you look closely there at the top of the gunwale, there is that white strake with the mooring bits on it. We've increased the freeboard by that amount, just to be on the safe side moving forwards. But having been on the slipway for so long last year, look at the state of the mud. I mean, there was no mud there in that quantity when she was hauled out of the water. So before she went back in, after the first part of the work, that ought to be swept away. And she came off the slipway at 5:30 in the morning on Thursday, the 8th of December. And to everyone's relief, she didn't leak. Obviously, that's tremendously important when you put a boat in the water, when you've done this amount of work. You have to be looking around all the time, at every nook and cranny, just to make sure that defective welds which are letting through water. Here we are in the forward saloon, once again looking aft. The hole in the bulkhead there, the little hole for a porthole, Chris Smith put that in, or wanted that put in the Medway years, so we could have cups of tea pass through from the tea bar in which that porthole enters, and the engine room. That isn't a completely new bulkhead from those days, but we have retained the tea passing hole. There you can see the bow thrust motor about to go through the hole into the compartment underneath the foredeck. Here we are back in the aft saloon. One issue which is coming up or coming down the road in the next couple of years is that the Dart Harbour Commissioners are looking at making all of the domestic passenger vessels operating on the Dart have holding tanks. Currently, that's not a requirement for either the MCA or the Dart Commissioners. And with KC, that's an issue as to where one, as you can see there, which are going down, are pretty much on the ship's bottom. So KC doesn't have any bilges really, or low down accommodation where you could house these things. So we're just thinking at the moment what we might do about that. But that will almost certainly mean that we have to do a revamp of the lavatories on the ship. I think particularly we want to try and get all three of the lavatories together rather than the current situation where they're in the two different saloons. There we are again in the aft saloon, looking aft. Again, you can see that just no, Casey had no bilges really. When you're standing in the saloon, you're standing almost on the ship's bottom. And there we are in the forward saloon. We're a nice grey paint and all those nice new frames and stringers and such like. Another thing we're doing is removing the life rafts. When we were required before, about 1993, ships in Casey's class weren't required to carry life rafts. But when that became a requirement, we put them back aft to keep them away from the paddle wheels. But they're big structures and they're quite heavy, and that's in the area of the lowest freeboard. So we are moving the life rafts in this rebuild and replacing the round pods with flat pods, which are less obtrusive and less, you don't see them so much, and putting them on the bridge wings, which can be hidden by the canvas dodgers. Well, by April, steam was raised and she ran trials. So she had been out since this work. And I'm pleased to say that everything worked because one didn't want to find that the engine was madly out of alignment or whatever after it, but everything worked very well. And to do that, she obviously had to have the steering rigged up. And one thing we're not doing like the Swiss, all the Swiss have got hydraulic steering, hydraulic electric steering now, but we still have the good old fashioned wire and chain with chains in the wheelhouse connecting through wires down to chains right in the stern. And there Casey is back out of the water again now with Paul Merrington and Richie James. They really are an excellent company and they're excellent people. And I'm really impressed with the work that's been going on there. The anchor chain is out for inspection. The paddle boxes are being scraped down and will be painted up again for the new season. And there on the starboard side, you can see the strake underneath the deck, which was renewed this year. And on the top left there, you can see the extent of the white, which is how we've increased the freeboard there. That's the same on the port side. It's not a lot of increase, but I think it was important to do. And I don't think people are really going to notice it, really. I mean, it looks as though one might have put a canvas dodger along there. And there's another shot of it inside looking at that. And previously, to enter that forward compartment, you had to take away steps and such like and unbolt a plate in the forward bulkhead to get into that forward compartment. Obviously, that would not be suitable with the bow thrust engine in it, and so we have fitted a new hatch there so that there's access into the bow thrust compartment through that. So where are we now, and where are we going? Basically, by the return to service this summer, we will have completed all the steelwork, including the hull and decks from the engine under the stern. That's all done. All the steelwork to above the waterline from the engine under the bow. So back aft, that strake beneath the decks has been done, not ahead of the engine room. And we've renewed all the bulkheads throughout. Every single bulkhead is now new, and we renewed all the stringers, keels, and frames, etc. And that has cost us only 500k, well, not quite 500k. And for next winter, what we're looking at doing is completing the steelwork straight below the deck forward of the engine room and renewing the foredecks, all the decks up to the bow, at a cost of around 200k. The spend to date has been about 400,000, which is a pittance for the work that's been done. If you compare that with the Swiss, to rebuild a Swiss paddle steamer, you're looking at 12 to 15 million pounds, one of their larger paddle steamers. Well, scaling that down to KC size, you're looking at 2 to 3 million pounds. So the work has been done at a knockdown in-house price, and a lot of credit for that has got to go to Dart Pleasurecraft, the Dart Railway, contributing, as I said earlier, their facilities, contributing the use of their labour. The biggest costs really have been external contractors who were brought in to do the steelwork, etc. But it's still been done very much on the cheap by commercial standards. So where's it from so far? Well, we have financed this out of the surplus from trading from the revenue on the Medway years, which we still had. Charter fees from the Dart company over the last 10 years, a substantial grant from the PSPS, for which we're immensely grateful, and fundraising through our website, flyers, press releases, etc. And since we started fundraising for this project, we have raised through the website and the PO box and the flyers, etc., about 107k. And that includes some fairly sizable personal donations and the in-kind donations from DPC. So we've got all the funding in place for all that we've done so far, but we still do need funding for the next phase of the project next winter, when we're renewing that strake underneath the deck and the foredeck. And we're looking to raise another 200k for that for next year. So do please keep the donations coming in to help us with that. And thank you very much for all who have contributed so far. Another real plus is that we've now signed a new 25-year charter agreement with the Dartmouth Railway. So Casey's future is secure. She's part of an established business with a sustainable business model. And I think it's hard to beat that combination of the steam railway and the steamship. And she's running in a honeypot location. I mean, day in, day out during the summer, the trains from Paynton to Kingswear are delivering hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of passengers. And I think we also benefit from the enormous goodwill towards her from the management, the staff, and all the locals. Certainly my biggest concern when Casey, when I was sort of approaching, we're over 60, etc. Well, what do we do with her, with the future? How do we find a future for her, which is sustainable? Well, I think, this is a wonderfully sustainable future. And it's not dependent upon exciting things, etc. It's a day in, day out, fairly simple structure. Well, why have we needed the money, and why do we need money? I think it's important to remember that Casey doesn't require any operating subsidy. I mean, she washes her face in operating and covers her annual maintenance costs. So that is very, very sustainable. But she doesn't generate sufficient surplus to cover this rebuild. And we thank you for all who have contributed so far. And we need a further 200k to complete the rebuild next winter, and we need your help with this. I think also in terms of the business model at Dartmouth, it's difficult to better it. There is this huge volume of people coming on the train, and the Dart management are very keen on using KC as part of that, which is why they're very keen on having her running harbour cruises from Dartmouth, where you get that combination of a trip on the steam railway to Kingswear and then a trip on the river on a steamship. COVID has meant that they have changed their policies in a number of areas. I mean, for example, the steam train doesn't stop at any stations between Paignton and Kingswear now. And the number of trips which they run to Totnes has been reduced. They now don't run to Totnes with their ordinary boats every day in the season, which in earlier years they used to do. And they've found that this is a more cost-effective operating model, and they're particularly keen on this combination of the steam railway to Kingswear and then the steam harbour cruise on a paddle steamer. And I think we need to be very pleased that KC is at the heart of their thinking on that. So with your help, we can set KC up for the next 25 years, running in our own home waters here on the River Dart. And if you would like to contribute, you can do so through our website, www.kingswearcastle.org, or you can send checks to our PO Box 9565, Weymouth DT 44HT. But once this work is out of the way by 2024, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have KC set up with your assistance for the future. So that's the main part of my presentation. I'm very happy to take questions, and if anybody would like to provide any questions or ask any questions, then you can type them into the chat function on the keybar. So I'll hand you now back to Graham. Thank you. Oh, before I hand you back, we've got some questions going in. So I've got a question here from Carl Trotter. Speaking of restorative replacement, put the vessel through the ship of Theseus concept, how much of the PS Kingswear Castle is original? Well, there is a lot of originality in KC, but obviously steelwork is replaced and wooden decking is replaced, and that is the case really on all historic ships. I mean, if you go and look at the Victory, how much of the woodwork on the Victory is original? And she's currently in a major rebuild at the moment. Her hull's been sagging. So I'm afraid replacing things that corrode and rot is sort of all part of keeping a historic ship in service. Anybody else like to ask me more questions? Any other questions? I've got no more questions coming up. In which case, if there are no more questions, although you can come back in if you want to, I will, in the meantime, hand you back to Graham.
Yep, well, thank you very much, John. That was very, very informative. So if there are no more questions, I'll call on Gordon Wilson to give the vote of thanks.
On behalf of everyone watching the live stream this evening, and all who will watch it on YouTube in the coming weeks, I would like to thank John Megoran most sincerely for providing us with such an in-depth and interesting account of the work being undertaken to rebuild Kingswear Castle. Not many saltwater vessels reach their centenary, so it is good to see that Kingswear Castle should be in fine fettle for our 100th birthday in 2024, and well beyond. It was particularly interesting to see examples of the work required to keep much younger ships in operation and to be reminded of Casey's own history and the work previously done to keep her in service. The pictures of all the old and new steelwork and the old and new woodwork fully illustrate the extent and the quality of the work being done and the progress being made. It would also be right to extend thanks to the Dart Company, who are carrying out so much of the work in their own shipyard and who now consider the paddler to be a valuable part of their business. Despite the high quality of the work, it is remarkable that costs are relatively modest because of the many parts of this which are being met by the Dart Company themselves. Although John is no longer in command of Kingswear Castle, it's good to witness his continuing passion for her after 40 years of close association. So, for your talk and all you're doing to safeguard this important part of the UK's maritime heritage, thank you, John.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gordon. So that's all for this evening, folks. Many thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a great summer and get the opportunity to sail somewhere in the UK. And remember, as with all YouTube videos, you can help the channel by clicking the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much. Good night.